You're listening to the Rule of Life podcast by Practicing the Way. In each season, we explore an ancient practice from the way of Jesus and its relevance for the modern era. This is Season 5, Generosity.
Yo, everybody, welcome back to the Rule of Life podcast, Season 5. We're talking about generosity. My name's Christian. I'm here with John Mark.
Hello.
And let's just jump straight into it.
Okay.
The theme of session 2, it's watch out for greed.
Yes.
So let's go into it. I remember you sharing this story in the practice. And if you haven't watched the practice yet, go and do that. It is worth all of your time.
Yes.
You share this really interesting story, and I'd love for you to recap that to start.
Yeah, it's actually a recent story. Not long ago, I was hiking up in Malibu with a few buddies. And we went on this hike to a waterfall, and it had just rained. And so we got super muddy, like we're crossing the stream. Mm-hmm. So we get back to the house, and we sat by the hose for a few minutes, and we washed off our shoes because our shoes were all covered in mud. And it took a while. There were 4 of us. So we're washing off our shoes, and just somehow, just dudes on a Saturday post-hiking, the conversation fell to what a big deal shoes were, like in middle school and elementary school. And if you know anything about social Darwinism applied to middle school group psychology, shoes are the status symbol of choice. Even my kids go to a school where you have to wear uniforms, and they plot everybody where they're at on the economic thing by the shoes people wear, because everybody has to wear the same outfit.
Yeah, that's real.
And so shoes were such a big deal when I was a kid. And I don't remember the year they came out, but I'm old enough now that Air Jordans came out when I was a kid. And so that was everybody wanted a pair of Air Jordans. All of us came from kind of, lower middle class families, so none of us had Air Jordans.
Yep.
And we all wanted them. None of us had them. I think they were $99 at the time, which, when I was a kid, that was a fortune, right? And so it was just like a passing conversation moment. We go back, we wash off our shoes, say goodbye, go back to our lives. A couple hours later, there's this group text, right, from the guys. So I get a text from Micah, and it's a screenshot of his Instagram feed. Okay. And there's an advertisement,
of course,
for Air Jordans. Wait for it, on sale for $99.
No way. Okay, that part's a little creepy.
And then Ben texts. And he doesn't have social media because he is a good person. And he had just gone to his web browser, and the first advertisement that came up on his web browser was for Air Jordans. And we're just laughing, literally Instagram sitting there in somebody's right pocket, listening to our conversation, and then tweaking the algorithm to, hey, yeah, we can give you Air Jordans for $99.
For this price,
exactly.
Yeah.
And it's just, this is what, the Harvard professor, Shoshana Zuboff, she calls it surveillance capitalism. That's her name for the new economic model of algorithm-based advertising. And, they say we see something like 3,000 to 5,000 advertisements a day. And that's been going on for decades, since at least World War II. But where it's radically changed is now algorithms are able to listen to our conversations. Literally, this stuff is listening to us when our phone is off and in our pocket.
I've gotten got by it.
10 feet away. Yeah. Listening to our conversations, data mining for our deepest fears, insecurities, which is where news algorithms come from, angers, outrage, desires, lust. What your eye just hovers over an image on your screen, and it will begin to customize advertising to you. And so, never have we been more vulnerable to the manipulation of the brokenness of the human heart. But if you could imagine a world hundreds of years ago, pre-advertising, pre-algorithms, still there is this deep, going back to Genesis 3 that we were chatting about in the last session or episode, broken piece in the human heart of greed, really, of a broken desire for more. And so the truth that cuts across the entirety of the human experience is, the saying, the more you get, the more you want. And we think that buying that new shirt or getting that nicer house or upgrading our car or whatever it is, major or minor, that will make us feel, now I have enough.
Right.
But every time we cross the line moves.
Right.
It's the proverbial carrot on the stick.
More money, more problems.
And more money, yes. So then you're going to take it even further. So the more you get, the more you want, right? So trying to satisfy desire by, satisfying desire it just does not work because desire begets desire. So psychologists call it the hedonic treadmill. The way hedonism works, it's like you're walking on a treadmill. You're always walking forward. You're never arriving. You never feel like you have enough. It's the famous, Rockefeller line, the oil tycoon. They asked him, how much money is enough? And he said,
a little bit more.
Just a little bit more. I read a recent one from Donald Trump in the late 80s. They asked him, how much money would it take for you to be happy? And he said 10% more. And I was like, that's the feeling. Just 10% more or 50% more or whatever your percentage is. People have a number often in mind or percentage in mind. But yes, what you're saying is absolutely, this is where the counterintuitive teachings of Jesus kick in. Not only does more money not equal more happiness, more satisfaction, it actually equals less satisfaction, but often more money, more problems.
Yeah.
It often more money equals more neuroticism, more to worry about. Like I remember when a therapist said to me, John Mark, it seems like the more money you make, the more of a negative relationship you develop with money.
Oh, man.
I was like, holy cow, because I was starting to worry about it. And, it's all this human frailty.
Yeah, it came straight for you.
That comes right in.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the more you get, the more neurotic you become, and often the more hurried you become. Alan Fadling has that line, the desire to possess is an engine for hurry. And things we often don't realize come with a time tax. So there's the cost of the item. But then there's the cost of I haven't had a motorcycle in years and I really want another motorcycle. And so there's motorcycles aren't too expensive. You can get a nice one for, a couple grand even or $5,000. But, it's cheaper than a car. So there's the cost. I can save up the money and there's all the time that it takes to make that money.
Right.
And then you're spending your time on this thing, a motorcycle, or let's take something small, a t-shirt or whatever.
Yep.
But then there's the time tax for what it takes to use the item, care for the item, repair the item, keep working to fund the item. So there's this time tax that comes with everything. So often the more we get, the less time we have. And we become materialism, rich and time poor. And then we become hurried and stressed and anxious and exhausted. And so it's just, the doom loop of Western materialism is so profound. So what I do in this session is I just go for the jugular. I just start with, Jesus has the wealth, the weight of Jesus' teachings on money are a warning against the danger of it. So I just go through a kind of lightning round of Jesus' warnings about money. I'll name one that I start with, which is Luke chapter 12. Watch out for greed, exclamation point. Next line, life does not consist of an abundance of possessions.
That doesn't need much translation.
It doesn't need much translation. I could give you the Greek stuff, but you kind of get the point of that.
I get it. Yep. No.
And greed. So greed is a major theme in Jesus' teaching, right? Major one of his accusations against the Pharisees, one of the few sins that he calls out by name, which is really interesting. When he's critiquing the Pharisees, he talks about how they're the outside of the cup is beautiful, the inside of the cup is foul and nasty. Yeah. And he said it's full of wickedness and greed. Wickedness, generic term. Sinfulness. Greed is the one specific sin he calls out. The only sin he calls out specifically by name, in particular with religious people, is greed. And this is really interesting how religious people often have high sensitivity towards sexual immorality or theological immorality or pride, all things that I think we should be sensitive against. But often we will have an incredibly high tolerance for the sin of greed because in our culture, accumulation and acquisition is celebrated, not critiqued. So we call somebody who is wealthy successful. They might be on marriage number 4, kids that hate them, and be like, oh, that dude's really successful. What we mean is they're really good at their job and they make a lot of money. Successful is a synonym in American culture for wealth, yes, and career success. Okay. So often we're just so numb in this area. And so, one thing that struck me in writing this practice was, I've been in pastoral work for 20 plus years, and it's a great privilege and honor. People confess a lot to you in this role. Yeah, sure. And I've had people confess, I had somebody confess 2 abortions to me 2 days ago. I've had people confess all sorts of addictions, pornography stuff, adultery, affairs, abuse, incest. Gnarly stuff.
Praise God for healing, man.
like heavy stuff that you get to hold with people. It's an honor and a privilege to walk with people toward the light, the healing light of Jesus. I cannot remember a single time in 20 plus years of pastoring that anyone has ever confessed greed to me.
Wow.
I can't think of a single person that came to me and said, I'm really greedy, will you pray for me? Or I just bought this car I don't need, and it was a total greed move.
Yeah.
And I just, what is that?
Yeah. I've only heard it once. I'm in a group of guys who we confess sin to each other every month. And we do it for years. And that was like the first time someone's ever was like, man, I'm really struggling with greed. I'm past making enough for my family. I just want a little bit more. But I've once in my life, I'm 32. That's it.
Wow. So what is that? A therapist said to me last week, he said, how do you know if you're self-deceived? And I could tell it was kind of a trick question. And I thought about it. I was like,
hold eye contact, stay quiet.
I don't know. And then he said, you don't.
Oh gosh. Yeah.
So how do we know if we're self-deceived when it comes to money and greed and whether or not we are greedy? And, greed is it's like lust, but for things. And so it's not just a desire for more things. It is that, but it's also like lust in objectification.
Oh, yeah.
So when you lust after another person, you're not just wanting sexual pleasure from them, you're objectifying them. So they're not a human soul that you want to give to. They're a sexual object that you want to take from, which is why there's no loving version of pornography. Yeah. It's all lust. And it's why the West is so contorted, because it often thinks that lust is love. And which puts greed at the heart of romance, not generosity. Getting, not self-giving, at the heart of a romantic relationship. And hence the divorce rate and dysfunction and brokenness and sexual addiction and all of this. So, greed it's not just this unsatiable desire for more that's in all of us at some level, but it is the objectification of things for happiness and people for happiness. And people then become objects that are in your way. Coworkers are in your way on your, I was chatting to somebody who's very successful, a friend of mine, who is now the president of his company. And he said it's been really hard since he was promoted to this really important job, because every single person there sees him as the next doorway toward their vision of happiness, which is more money. And he sees them all fighting with each other to get from him what he has a limited amount to give, promotions or whatever, And he's an incredibly generous guy. And so it was a good conversation. But all that to say, how do you know if you're greedy? Often you don't. And this is where we need to get outside of the echo chambers of we can talk about this later, but our class, our culture, our zip code, our neighborhood. We need to travel the world if at all possible. We need to make relationships across socioeconomic lines.
Absolutely.
And that becomes increasingly incumbent upon us the more money we make. But the weight of Jesus' teachings on money are negative. Yeah. They are a warning against greed. And so in the rest of the session, I won't go into it now, we go into the biblical concept of contentment as an antidote to greed. So how generosity can bring about this place of contentment, which is like a happiness with what you have. So if greed is, I'm not happy, I need more to be happy, that lie we believe, that feeling we have in our body, an unsatisfied desire, contentment is happy. It's a synonym for happiness. It's satisfied desire. I'm happy.
Satiated,
whose I am, who I am, how I am, what I have, what I don't have. I'm content. It means I'm happy.
Yeah.
And then we talk about this kind of sub-discipline of generosity, of simplicity. So we might want to come back to that later, but that's kind of the rest of this practice is Jesus' call to contentment and the call to living a simpler life. Chesterton had that famous line, there are two ways to get enough. One is to continue to accumulate more and more. The other is to desire less. And as a friend of mine who does a lot of generosity work said to me recently, he's like, there's two ways to be rich, get more or want less. And he said, the second one's not only a lot cheaper, it's a lot easier.
Yeah.
And this is the Christian path of training our heart to want less and to be deeply happy and content with what we have. This is the possibility that following Jesus' way of generosity can set our heart free from greed, from enslavement to greed, which is a terrible feeling.
It is.
You never have enough, and you work yourself haggard half the time, waste, your precious fleeting life shopping and doing this nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
And you never get to this place of happiness and satisfaction, or you do, but it's cotton candy. It's like, oh man, I got this new fit and it's great for like 3 days.
Yeah,
and then you're like, okay.
I need the next thing. thing. It makes me think of even the interplay of different practices like Sabbath. I remember when I started practicing Sabbath, one of the things I wrote down to do or not do was actually, we don't spend on the Sabbath.
Yes, which is a historic kind of practice codified in the Torah.
Yeah.
No buying, no selling.
We have
blue laws in America, blue laws in America for many years. Yeah, you couldn't shop. Nothing was open.
And it was all about rehearsing and remembering, I live in the world of a generous God and I have all that I need. I'm content. And it actually, I have noticed it does spill into generosity a bit, where you're like, when I have all that I need, I actually don't need to keep spending on myself. It releases me. In some ways, it releases me from greed. So I guess I'm curious, is that part of why you think Jesus has such a negative view of greed or wealth or money? Or not of greed, of course, but of wealth and money? Or what's the connection there? You're alluding to that.
No, I think there's two sides to it. It's not just that, the part of the danger of wealth. So Jesus talks about the deceitfulness of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
It's really interesting. Not the evil of wealth, the deceitfulness of wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So wealth is a liar because it promises what it can't give. So wealth promises it will make you happy, and it doesn't. I mean, yes, there's a rising happiness level until you get to a kind of middle class, maybe upper middle class-ish life.
Yeah.
Correlation, sure. Not that you need to get to that to be happy, but there's a, correlation. But it doesn't actually make you happy. You can be, just look at any billionaire of choice who are miserable people, half of them. It's proof that this does not make you happy.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't satisfy you.
Mm-hmm.
It promises safety and security, that your anxiety will go away and you won't have fear for your future. And actually, it often exacerbates anxiety because wealth is fleeting. It surely makes wings and flies away, the proverb says. And so often, even if you have wealth, then you now worry about losing your wealth. So you don't, all that to say, it promises what it cannot give. So there's a positive side of Jesus' teaching on that. I think he just wants you to know this is not where life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. The happiness you search for, the satisfaction, the meaning of life, the good life, just that's not the path. Materialism is not the path.
Yeah.
But then you can't it's not just positive. There is a negative side to it. Jesus seems to have a very negative view of wealth. He doesn't seem to have the wealth as neutral. You can kind of get there maybe through Paul, but it's hard to get to, like I said this to a friend of mine the other day. I said, man, I've been doing all this research in generosity. I said, Jesus really, and actually a rich person said this to me. He said, well, Jesus has nothing good to say about wealth.
Like nothing.
And I repeated that line to my friend. I was like, well, yeah, Jesus has basically nothing good to say about wealth, which is, I think, a bit of an overstatement. And I could tell my friend activated something emotionally in him. He's a wonderful soul, but I could tell it just straight, he didn't like that.
Yeah.
It bothered him. And he's like, well, and the only thing he could think of was he quoted that really odd, obscure parable. He goes, well, make friends with unrighteous mammon.
Yeah, that's the one on my kitchen wall,
That's the closest he could get to. And I'm not slamming my friend. He's lovely.
Yeah.
I'm just saying that I think that moment betrayed the human heart. We're like, what? No, because it's mammon is our God and of our culture.
It's deceitful above all hearts.
Often our own heart. So Jesus seems to have a very negative view of wealth. And I think there's a number of reasons. I think the primary reason is that wealth lures us away from finding our safety, security, and satisfaction in God to the false promise of believing the lie that we can find safety, security, and satisfaction in money and possessions. And so, Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it this way: worldly possessions tend to turn the hearts of disciples away from Jesus. And so it seems to be that there's a high correlation between wealth accumulation and hearts turning away from Jesus. And in my own pastoral experience, there's not a lot of people that I have seen, but because of the churches I've worked in have always had so many young people, you inevitably see some of those young people, become widely, quote, successful by the American definition of that term, whether they start a business, like I think of one person that started a business that he just sold for an obscene amount of money. And so in those examples where I've seen people make a ton of money, in almost every single example, it has been very bad for them. They're either not Christians anymore, or they're very nominal. They become very distant from the community of Jesus. And there's even reasons I have compassion for there. Often then people want their money and they become isolated. They become distracted. It starts often just with like they buy a vacation home and then they're kind of gone. And they're kind of not really in community much anymore because they're traveling all the time. And then they get another. And there's varying levels of this. But I do see pastorally, and this is anecdotal, evidence, but high correlation between wealth accumulation and spiritual decline.
Yeah.
This is the whole Jesus line, like it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy person to enter the kingdom of God. So in Jesus' mind, wealth is an obstacle to the good life.
Yeah.
It is not a boon. Yeah. So it's harder to enter the kingdom. And you could just translate that into American as it's harder to live a happy life with God if you are wealthy than if you are not. That's so counterintuitive.
It is. It's a tough pill to swallow too, because we're being formed by our whole world to say
that's the pathway in. And Jesus is saying, oh no, you can't even get through the door with that, or it's really hard. So of course we all want to think we're the exception to the rule. Yeah. Like, yes, that's really hard for most people, but I could do it, Jesus. Test me, I'll handle it. And maybe you will, but you would be the exception to the rule. So the other thing that is just hard to say, but I think it needs to be said, is that it seems to be that the wealth of the biblical evidence would say that higher levels of wealth are often correlated with a number, this is generalization, of negative character traits. Entitlement, pride, vanity, independence, greediness, lack of empathy, compassion. Now, this is not a hard and fast rule. I know some really wealthy people, all of whom, by the way, are wildly generous, who are not like this. But like the stereotype, like, did you see that TED Talk, Does Money Make People Mean?
No.
So there's a University of California guy, Paul Piff, social psychologist, who studies this. He studies the correlation between wealth and virtue. And he has now scientifically demonstrated that, again, as a general rule, people, let me see, I have a quote here. What we're finding is that as a person's level of wealth increases, their feelings of compassion and empathy go down, and their feelings of entitlement, of deservingness, and their ideology of self-interest increases. So he started just doing like simple things where he'd sit two college students down with Monopoly and he'd give one way more money than the other, and then he'd observe their behaviors. And like at that level, basic level, they were meaner. Wow. So the answer, does money make you mean? His answer is absolutely yes. So that just means if we live in and if people are listening to this from all across the world and all sorts of different, it's very hard to talk about money. There's so many sensitivities here. We all have different levels. But let me just not even talk about myself. I live in the wealthiest and most greedy cultures in the history of humanity. And so we have to like really have a sobriety when we take Jesus' teaching seriously. And they don't have to bum us out. I think there's that front line like, oh man, this is hard. But they do not have to bum us out. They actually need to set our heart free.
Practicing the Way is a crowd-funded nonprofit made possible by The Circle and other givers. The Circle is a group of people from all over the world who believe deeply in the work of spiritual formation and discipleship and give monthly to see formation integrated into the church at large. I am Maria Fuder from Zurich, Switzerland, and I am part of this community. I love giving to Practicing the Way because their beautifully crafted resources are profoundly helping me and my church learn the way of Jesus, offering an alternative way of life as we follow him in our city, and I want others to have access to these resources too.
We're talking a lot about the impacts and Jesus' warnings on what money and wealth, et cetera, does to the individual, but I want to speak to it maybe to the corporate. There's warnings, I think, also about even in the biblical story, what greed and accumulation and taking does to societies and peoples. As you're speaking and as I've reflected on it, it makes me think of this line from a friend, David Bailey, who's part of Arbonne, if you know him.
Oh, I love him. I was actually chatting to him a week or two ago.
He's brilliant and doing such good kingdom work in the U.S. in particular. But he said this line, it's like stuck with me. He said, racial hierarchy is a spiritual principality manifested economically, legislated politically, and that it impacts us all relationally.
Wow.
And I just want to maybe lean into that. We've talked about what is the warnings of Jesus and the scripture do for me individually, but what about us?
Yeah, I mean, I'm betraying my Western individualism there by not thinking through that lens, but you could not be more right. I mean, even just, I'm no expert on this subject, but I know David is, but the transatlantic slave trade was, fueled by Mammon.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's all money driven. And money in the tangential level, like, why did slavery persist for so long in a Christendom culture where people knew it was wrong? One, like, benign answer is because people wanted sugar in their coffee and tea every morning.
It's crazy. It's asinine.
And, and it's easy to kind of like distance yourself from injustice. It happens with fast fashion today. You're like, well, I'm not oppressing the poor, but we're wearing cheap t-shirts and we don't realize there's a huge link between that. 200 years ago is I don't own slaves, but you have a cotton dress and you put sugar in your coffee or your tea in the morning. And that's what's fueling this Mammon. And so, there are huge sectors of our society. Racism would be, systemic racism in our nation's history and present at some level would be a good example. But there are huge sectors of our society that are run by the worship of Mammon.
Oh, absolutely.
So I just read, Jonathan Haidt's new book, The Anxious Generation, which is on the impact of social media on Gen Z and the mental health. I think he would argue the science now is utterly conclusive that social media is causing, not correlated with, causing mental health epidemic across Gen Z and all sorts of societal like fracturing and breakdown. And brilliant book. But you just realize like all of this could be fixed.
Totally.
If business leaders in Silicon Valley and other places decided to still make money, just make less of it.
Yep.
The economic model that is behind and underneath and shaping the actual technology of social media on various platforms could all be changed. If you paid, all you'd have to do is like subscribe and pay $10 a month to Instagram. They'd change a number of features. They change the algorithms. You make it so that they don't make more money based on whether or not you are distracted by it, how much time you give to it, pay for service. Like you could solve 80% of the damage caused by social media. Not all of it, but a lot of it. But Mammon, it just drives this stuff. So pick your example: systemic racism, transatlantic slave trade, social media today, fast fashion. So much of this Mammon, food is a great example.
Billions of dollars goes to waste every year just to keep the shelves looking pretty.
So yes, there is absolutely a corporate, a community, a society-wide level and application of this warning.
And it feels like part of those things, as we're talking about, one of the motivations again is greed. It comes to that ache of like, I don't have enough. But then let me ask, like, how then do we define what is enough? Who has enough?
That's the question.
Is mine enough? Your enough? Is your enough? My enough? My family, my mom's side of the family lives in a small village in Ethiopia. I'm for sure at enough compared to them. Or my wife's family is from Lagos, Nigeria. And you could literally just drive over the bridge and see the difference between people. So who decides who has enough and when it is?
Yeah, so that is the great question. I remember a number of years ago, before I discovered, I think, really the joy of generosity, I was just so disturbed by Jesus' teachings. And I was on money. And I was so disturbed and troubled by the spectrum of Christian teaching on it. There's hardly any Christian teaching on this, but when you actually do find what's out there, you get the huge, mostly it's prosperity gospel voices, right? And so it's mostly about giving more to your church, and then the pastor asking for more is wearing like $5,000 shoes and stuff like that. Or then you get like the radical kind of, super hardcore Anabaptist, like, and I have much respect for it, but it's so radical. It's hard to like, I don't want to recycle my toilet paper. It's like, I respect it. I respect it.
Respect.
You could even get me to, hey, Jesus would be more like that than like me. But it's just like, I'm not there yet. I need to trust Jesus more, but type of thing. And before I build my own outhouse in the backyard illegally to whatever. So again, I'm not poking fun at it. I respect it, but there's such a spectrum. So I went out and read all this literature. Craig Blomberg's book was probably the most helpful. I think it's called Give Me Neither Poverty Nor Riches or something like that. But Biblical Theology of Money. But I read diversely, different opinions, different perspectives. And then I went out and I asked like a bunch of older Christians that I respect. Like, what's your view? This question: how much is enough? Like how much is enough? Is this appropriate how I'm living in this lifestyle, or is this inappropriate for a follower of Jesus? And what I found is they all told me that enough is how much money they make and spend. And that's not to slam them. I just got their thing. And the real challenge, and this I think at some level should set our heart free from anxiety, and it should drive us to listening, prayer, and discernment, is the reality that wealth is relative.
Totally.
And that saying can be abused, so please don't mishear my heart here. But wealth is relative, and it is society-wide, which is why the poorest 5% of Americans that we would consider very poor are wealthier than like 99%
wealthier than my family in
the world.
Ethiopia, for sure.
But they don't feel wealthy, which is why happiness in nations is often correlated to the lack of income disparity. So you might have a higher happiness level in many African nations, actually. Several African nations have very high levels of happiness, and they're all where there's very similar income levels across the board.
A lot of times very rich, very poor.
Yep, it's one of the arguments for why there's higher happiness levels in Scandinavia. Whereas nations like America, South Africa, others that have really high disparity, England, in wealth outcomes, have lower levels of society-wide happiness. So, and part of that's because wealth is relative. So, Amos, the prophet, like laments and rails against like wealthy women that use lotion. So I put on some like
I don't want to be
cheap Eucerin this morning because I have dry skin, and I don't feel like I was sinning by putting lotion on, nor do I feel like, oh, I'm rich. I'm just like rolling in the gold because I put some lotion on my calves this morning.
Right.
Because that's just, to me, you have lotion.
Yeah.
But most people around the world don't have lotion, or many people don't. So wealth is relative, and so that becomes a challenge. And there are hours of conversation here that I will discipline myself not to get into. And there's no way that this is a really sensitive question, because there is no way to talk about it without getting into issues of class. We hate, or whatever, that's a less gross word is than people in your peer group economically. Here's, I think, a general principle that I think is a general principle. It's not sharp enough for a lot of us, but I think it's a good starting place. I think the general principle is people should look at our lives. They should look at the clothes we wear, the home or apartment we live in, the car we drive if we have a car, or bicycle we ride, or public transportation we take. They should look at how often we eat out and where. And if they had to guess, if I don't know how much money you can make, but if I should look at your life and I should guess, I think together they make this much. My guess should be wrong. You should make significantly, the general rule is we should make more than most people would guess that we make, because we have intentionally chosen to live below the line of our income in order to create margin and live simply and peacefully, and to live generously and give much away. So, most people, if there's a line that's your income level, most people live at the line, like they just spend every penny they make, or over the line in debt. So like Southern California, LA, Orange County is even worse, but parts of LA are nuts, where like the culture is you want to project to the world that you are a billionaire or a multi-million. You want to project this image. So like I was chatting to somebody in Orange County the other day, and there are parts of Orange County that are insanely wealthy. And they were showing me this map that you can look at online that shows debt by counties. Orange County is one of the most debt-ridden counties in the country. I was chatting to a lady in Newport Beach who leads a women's Bible study. She started charging for it because they started doing food. And she told me about all these women that would pull up in G-Wagons and Louis Vuitton clothing and had to apply for scholarships, because they were so to the end. There are people living paycheck to paycheck, radically in debt, one bad moment away from bankruptcy, trying to live so far above the line. So I think the way of Jesus is the opposite of that. It's, we are, and again, this is once your basic life necessities are met. So if you're hearing this and you're a college student, or you're a victim of oppression, or at some level you don't have your basic needs met, I'm not talking to you. But once you get past that level, the idea should be, yes, we live below the line to live generously, peacefully, simply, and joyfully with Jesus.
You know, even as you say that, I can feel I've been having moments come back to my mind I remember going to an event that I was leading worship at, and I could feel the pressure for me to change my clothes for every session.
Oh, interesting.
And it's like a subtle way of like, and I was like, I didn't sweat, I'm fine. But like, you know, sometimes you go, oh yeah, are you going to change? Do you need a moment to change before the next session?
That image projection.
It's image projection, and it's really subtle. And I remember I would go on these a couple month long kind of worship tours, going to these events where I think I'm embarrassed the number of pairs of shoes that I take, because now I wear basically the same pair of Air Force Ones every day, you know, where then there was a thing in my mind of, well, I should probably have more than one pair of shoes to show. And, you know, that you can play out in a number of scenarios, but I'm just noticing the critiques in myself of, man, practice of simplicity then is a way that I can index my heart in light of this.
And this is where Jesus does not give us a math equation. You know, he does not tell us how many pairs of shoes is too many pairs of shoes to own. Now, if you're an American, just probably less.
Yeah, probably less.
Your guess is,
if
you were to ask Jesus, like, how many shoes should I own? He would probably say some version of
fucks up holes,
less, you know? So you could argue that every person needs 2 or 3 pairs of shoes. You know, you need a daily, you need an athletic, you know, shoe to exercise in. You need maybe whatever, a pair of dress shoes and a pair of everyday shoes, maybe 3, you know. But materialism is not rational.
No.
So, you know, if you have 20 pairs of shoes, that's not rational. You don't need that. That's emotional. Like we're trying to satisfy some deep, and listen, I have a theology of beauty, a theology of enjoyment, a theology of the arts. And I understand that many people apply that to fashion. Okay, sure. But this is where wealth, greed, is such a lovely, it's a sharp feeling of our heart that is often beautifully paired with a gentle invitation from Jesus to explore what's under that.
Yeah.
Why do you have so many, let's just talk about shoes. Why do you have so many pairs of shoes? Why? And what you find is that buying more, this is a silly example, but buying more shoes does not satisfy your desire for more shoes. You buy a pair of shoes and then you see another pair that you want next, and then another pair, and then another pair. Whereas what I find, this is what I found just through experimentation with just some basic low-level obedience to Jesus' teachings. When I have a desire for a new thing, like my car is getting, I'll use a very pragmatic example that people maybe will judge me for. My car is getting old. It's almost 20 years old now. It runs great. It's a great car. I love this car, but it's getting old. And I have a desire. The last couple months, I just really had a desire to get a new car. And I've wanted a truck. We moved up to the Santa Monica Mountains. I want a truck, man. I just want to like live in a truck. And there's this new electric truck out
now, you know?
that's like good for the environment. And I want this truck so bad. And I could afford to go buy this truck. And I sit with this desire. I pass it on the road, and I feel that pain of unsatisfied, of discontentment in my heart. Oh, not happy with my car. I want this other one. What I find is if I just will gently sit with that light sting of, I want something I don't have, it goes away. And honestly, I was on a run the other day, and we were both up in Vancouver filming.
Oh yeah.
And I was at my Airbnb, and I was running along the ocean, and I passed the truck, the exact truck that I want. I felt no desire in my heart. It's like, oh, it's fine. Just totally free. And I think what happens is if we can discipline our hearts through simplicity to just gently push away and discipline ourselves to live under our means, to live with less, the disciplined pursuit of a simpler life can actually set our heart free from the hedonic treadmill and the exhaustion and the neuroticism and the loneliness and social isolation and the numbing of our spiritual heart and conscience, the injustice that we're often accidentally causing or contributing to, can set our heart free if we can just gently sit with that sting and redirect it to God. And I end this session with one of my favorite, there's so many verses on contentment in the New Testament, but Hebrews, be content with what you have. Keep your heart free from the love of money. Be content with what you have, for he himself has said, I'll never leave you nor forsake you. Rooting contentment in life with God.
How do you see?
That's the way.
Is your eye healthy? That's beautiful. I want to end with a different prayer or reading that it's similar to one we've used in my church. And it's another way of indexing our heart. But before, again, I just want to say thank you to everyone for giving your time and energy and attention and even a heart. This is an emotional topic to think about these things, to follow Jesus more faithfully. Again, please comment. Let us know how this is impacting you. Tell your friends and family about it. Subscribe. And now let me leave you with this reading and prayer. Godliness with contentment is great gain. We bring nothing into this world and we take nothing out of it. We who call Jesus Lord devote ourselves to resisting greed, which plunges the human heart into ruin and it pierces it with many griefs. We are determined, though, to practice generosity with free hearts, fixing our hope on God and not the uncertainty of wealth. We desire to be rich in good deeds and willing to share all that we have, laying up for ourselves treasure that will not decay, but will shine in the age to come. Amen.
The generosity practice is a 4-week experience designed to be run in your church, small group, or community that combines teaching, conversation, and spiritual exercises to introduce you to this ancient discipline for life with God. If you come on this generosity practice, you will not just learn about generosity, you will learn how to live a more generous life. The end goal is to integrate generosity more richly into your rule of life, so that you can arrange your life around God. This practice is completely free thanks to the generosity of our friends in the Circle, a group of people from all over the world who give monthly to Practicing the Way. Available now at practicingtheway.org.